So, welcome everyone to this fifth seminar and last for 2012 of the Digital Classicist Seminar Berlin. I'm really glad to introduce Professor Jenny Strauss-Clay and Courtney Evans and Benjamin Jasnow, all from the University of Virginia, presenting mapping the Catalogue of Ships. Professor Jenny Strauss-Clay is Professor of Classics at the University of Virginia, and she has recently published, the last book was Homer's Trojan Theatre, Space Vision and Memory in the Iliad, that, as far as I understood, is setting the theoretical framework for this research project. But I hand over to you to tell us more about it.
First, thank you for having me, this is the first. This is the first presentation of this material, and we are very, very interested in your reactions, comments, suggestions, and I hope there'll be ample time for that at the end. So let me just begin with some general remarks. Book 2 of the Iliad notoriously contains a catalogue, which takes up 266 hexameters and enumerates 29 contingents that make up the Greek expedition to Troy. It includes nearly 190 place names. Most people find it boring, and a lot of readers simply skip it. But philologists and ancient historians love it for the many problems it raises. Before launching into the catalogue of the leaders of the Greek forces and the number of their ships, Homer appeals to the Muses to aid him in this tour de force of memory. Without their help, he says in the famous invocation, he says, "Tell me now, Muses, who inhabit Olympian homes, for you are goddesses, are present, and know all. We only hear rumors, nor know anything. Who were the leaders of the Danaans, and who their chiefs? The rest I could not name or recount, not if I had 10 tongues and 10 mouths, an unbreakable voice and a brazen chest within, unless the Olympian Muses, daughters of aegis-bearing Zeus, would remind me of how many came under Ilium." And then he ends by saying, "I shall list the leaders and all the ships." Now, there have been mountains of controversy about this catalogue. Was it borrowed from a poem that recounted the mustering of the Greeks of the Greek navies at Aulis, since Aulis is the second place named, and the neighboring Boeotian contingent, which we'll hear more about, receives what seems to be excessive space. Some of the place names mentioned seem to have disappeared during the so-called Dark Ages, between the collapse of the Mycenaean palaces and the 8th century. Does then the catalogue preserve a picture of Greece that harks back to the Mycenaean age? If so, the catalogue must have been preserved and transmitted orally through all those centuries, since the art of writing seems to have completely disappeared in the meantime. Or, as other scholars maintain, does the catalogue point to the 8th century Greece, or even later? Our first question was a very simple one. How did Homer, or a poet of the same name, manage to get through the catalogue at all without 10 mouths and 10 tongues? More precisely, how is it humanly possible to recite such a stupendous list without the use of writing? Scholars as early as Strabo have noted the catalogue's geographical organization, and it's evident. Go to Safari.
Where's Safari?
It's there at the bottom.
There we go.
Yeah, okay. Did I? Yeah, I'll be careful. Yes, I have noted the catalog's geographical organization and its evident topographical progression. And in particular, there have been several theories. Giovannini had a theory that the catalog followed the routes of the Theodokoi, who announced the Pan-Hellenic games throughout Greece. And Kuhlmann has recently put forth a similar argument, but he dates the catalog to the 7th century. In his commentary, however, Kirk notes, and I'm quoting him here, the arrangement of the catalog and its two major changes of direction could be the result not of particular precedents in the routes taken by, for example, religious ambassadors, but be based on inevitable facts in the geography of Greece itself, and the way that anyone, particularly without modern maps, might respond to them. More, he says, could be made of such an argument. And that's indeed the challenge we set ourselves. And we hope that you'll find this more revealing. It's also been noted that the epithets applied to the various toponyms seem to reflect fairly accurate knowledge of their geographical setting, suggesting that the composer of the catalog had some familiarity with the sites that he mentions. Inspired by research on cognitive mapping in connection with my recent book, which Matteo mentioned, Homer's Trojan Theater, I proposed that Homer was able to recite the catalog by creating a kind of mental journey that used the mnemonic techniques involving loci or places well known from ancient rhetorical writers. And I argue in the book that Homer already knew that technique. But let me give you a simple example of how that works. If I were to ask you to list the U-Bahn stops between Gromelanke and Alexanderplatz, there are in fact 20 such stops, and you have to transfer between lines to get there. The most efficient way to retrieve that list of stations is to imagine yourself on the train and mentally see the stops in order. And another simple example of this is how I learn the names of my students. I locate them in the classroom. Sometimes I even ask them to sit in the same place for the first few sessions. And that way I can reconstruct their names mentally by envisaging them. So I suggested that perhaps Homer could mentally walk, or in one case sail, through Greece and produce his detailed catalog of the Greek world. So we started exploring this possibility, attempting to reproduce the journey by showing that the itinerary described follows the natural contours of Greek geography and the pattern of early Greek urban organization. But we were also aware of other ways of organizing geographical space, one that is in fact used, and let me just point out, this is a map. There's one part you can't see below the map, which starts in Crete, goes over to Rhodes, and ends at Kos. That's obviously by sea. The most complex itinerary in sort of dark red or ochre begins in Aulis and then basically takes in all the Peloponnese and the eastern side, the eastern and southern side of Greece. And then you have a third itinerary that basically circumnavigates the whole of northern Greece. So there are really three separate itineraries. So that was one of the things we thought of in terms of itineraries. But we were also aware of another way of organizing space, and one that is in fact used in Homer in the much shorter catalogue of the Trojans and their allies. Now let's see if I can do this. That immediately follows the Catalogue of Ships. The arrangement there seems to start from a fixed point, that is Troy, and immediately followed by some of the surrounding countryside, but finally fanning out in four different directions, much like spokes on a wheel, to the furthest point before returning again to the starting point of Troy and then going out again. And we were also aware that the Homeric catalogue may be made up of shorter lists, drawn perhaps from other epic traditions that have been incorporated into this mother of all catalogues. Mapping the Catalogue of Ships has involved the use of various resources. And I must say right now that I have no knowledge of any of them. Ben Jasnow and Courtney Evans have really done all the work on this project. And they've been very lucky and blessed that it so happens that the Scholars Lab of the University of Virginia has developed this tool called Neatline. They will talk about it. And they've also used other tools available that will allow them to create an interactive map. The Barrington Atlas, the Homer Encyclopedia, Richard Talbot's Rome's World, and the website accompanying it, the Pleiades Project, and also something coming out of Stanford recently, an attempt to map Roman roads. So there are various things that have been used and have been used to inspire some of our work. What we want to do is to link the sites mentioned in Homer with the Iliadic texts, archaeological material, and useful bibliographies. In cases where the position of a site is unknown, and there are quite a few of those, we hope that our analysis might provide plausible evidence to help identify or pinpoint or zero in on a possible location. So what we're presenting is very much work in progress. And as I said, this is our first time that we've presented this material. So please wish us luck and no computer glitches. Thank you. This is Ben, who will be presenting the first part of our project.
Hi, thanks for having us. Our presentation today has two main objectives. First, we would like to tell you a little bit about the software that we have been using to map Homer's Catalogue of Ships. Second, we would like to briefly discuss some of our preliminary findings. So I'll begin with a brief explanation of the main tool that we've been working with, which is Neatline. Neatline is a geotemporal exhibit builder. It's designed by the Scholars Lab at the University of Virginia. Neatline combines the features of an archive, a timeline, and a map all in one interactive exhibit. You can use Neatline to plot locations, routes, battlefields, or really anything on a map. And the map for the display may be personalized to a great extent. You can use the various map layers provided by Google as the backdrop of your exhibit, Or you could provide a satellite photograph. You could provide a historical map, really anything you choose. There are also plans for non-map display options, for instance, a text annotation platform that will soon be available for Neatline. Once the map layer is in place, Neatline gives you the ability for further customization. You can draw on it and plot points and routes in various colors and shapes. Then you can attach all sorts of archival material to the items associated with a map. So you can attach bibliographic information, links, photographs, JPEGs of articles, etc. To gain access to the archival material, the person viewing the map just mouses over an item or the list of items to the side of the map. And right now, before proceeding, I'd just like to show you a little bit how this tool works. So this is one of our exhibits. This is Argos and the plain of Argos and Akte, the Akte Peninsula. And you can see that we have plotted a number of points, which we've customized by color coding. We've got blue and red. These are listed to the side. We have plotted some roads. And when you click on any of these exhibits, it gives you whatever information we've connected to the particular item. So here, for instance, we could go right to Pleiades. Can include a hyperlink. Still working. Well, we'll see if it goes. Other things that you can do. See if that will. You can also attach JPEGs and provide the thumbnails, and they should open very easily. On a speedy internet connection, these things open right away. So you can have associated bibliographic material connected right to your map. And then you can provide all sorts of extra material as well in the description. So you can provide background information, you can provide an interpretation, text, etc. So that's an example of certain things that Neatline is very good for. If anything catches your eye about this display, we'd love to hear it. If you have any criticisms, any ideas, we'd love to hear it. You can also add a narrative element to the map display by using Neatline's timeline feature. The display will add and subtract items associated with the map to reflect the use of space at any given time. So, for instance, one could plot the various stages of a battle using the timeline feature, so that map display would depict the battle arrangement on any given day or at any given time. Here is a demo version of that the Scholars Lab has produced. You can see that they are not using a default Google layer, they're using a historical map that they've scanned. And along the top, you've got a series of dates, and the user just scrolls over to change the arrangement of the map. You can see how useful this would be for, plotting anything with a temporal aspect. So the Scholars Lab will soon unveil a new Neatline feature that will be of special interest to classicists, namely the ability to link an annotated literary text to a map exhibit. So the map display changes according to the reader's position in the text, and Courtney is going to discuss this further in a moment. Before that, however, I'd like to take you through a couple of our exhibits to explain some of our initial findings and to point out some of Neatline's features. As Professor Clay just mentioned, our project seeks to examine how Homer makes use of landscape and geography to organize and perhaps to memorize his narration of the Catalogue of Ships. On a macroscopic level, the catalog can be plotted as an itinerary in a fairly straightforward way. Homer tends to move contiguously from one geographic region to the next. But understanding Homer's use of space and geography on a more local level is a much greater challenge. However, our initial research indicates that Homer is highly conscious of geography even in his descriptions of more localized regions. Indeed, in a couple of the cases we have investigated so far, Homer's city-to-city narration seems to approximate an itinerary. I will be discussing these two regions that we found so far, and Courtney is going to tackle a more difficult region in his portion of the presentation. So the first region, where Homer's use of space is very logical and approaches an itinerary, is Argos. Argos and the Akte Peninsula. Argos is the first of the Peloponnesian contingents. Region by region narration of the contingents has just come from Athens and Salamis and proceeds over to Argos. This is the realm of Diomedes, the first of the Peloponnesian kingdoms. Homer's narration of the Argos plain and Akte employs two syntactical groups, each governed by its own verb, dividing the contingent into one collection of 7 sites and another of 2. And we've color-coded these points on the map. So blue represents one syntactical group, and red represents another. With the first verb, akon, in line 559, Homer begins at Argos and then circumnavigates the Akte Peninsula. And we speak of circumnavigation here because although we have plotted some roads, wheeled travel was extraordinarily difficult in the southern Argolid. So if we are thinking in terms of a literal itinerary here, we're probably thinking more about sea travel than about wheeled travel. First come Argos and Tiryns in the Argive plain itself, and then continuing to the east, the narrator travels down the southern coast of the peninsula to Hermione and Acine, which are both, they share an epithet. They're both said to control the deep gulf. You may notice that Hermione and Acine come out of order. More on that in a moment. We then move up the northern side of Akte to Troezen, Eione, and Epidaurus, in that order. Having circled around Akte from the west to the east and back again, Homer now uses a second verb to mention the island of Aegina off the northern coast and the town of Masses on the southern coast of Akte before proceeding to the adjacent kingdom of Agamemnon and the Mycenaeans. So he's come in from Salamis, narrated Argos, and then proceeds to the immediately adjacent kingdom of Mycenae. The grouping of these sites raises certain questions. First of all, why have Aegina and Masses been grouped together? These are the points in red. And why are they separated from the rest of the sites, governed by their own verb? As an island separated from the geographic landmass containing all of the other Argive locations, it is not surprising that Aegina is appended as a sort of afterthought, and Kirk has mentioned this as well. But Masses is a more challenging case. Since it is located on the Akte Peninsula in close proximity to the rest of the Argive sites, which are otherwise narrated in a more or less logical geographical order, one would expect Homer to name Masses along with Hermione and Acine. So he would expect, one might expect these sites to be named all in tandem. But instead, he conjoins it with Aegina. It may simply be that Homer intends the voyage around Argos as a loop, out from the city, around the peninsula, and back again, before moving northwest to Mycenae. Perhaps then, Masses is named last as a way of closing the contingent, allowing the poet to return to the Gulf of Argos without repeating himself. So that would look something like this. He would make a loop around the peninsula and come back, closing the loop before proceeding northwest, but would avoid repeating any town names. But another potential solution arises from Hesiod's Catalogue of Women, fragment 155 most, 204 Merkelbach and West, where the same groupings recur. Aegina and Maces are named as a pair, in language identical to that used in the Catalogue of Ships, Aegina and Maces held by the sons of the Achaeans. In both Homer and Hesiod, then, Aegina and Maces are treated as a pair. This similarity may help to explain why Maces is not named along with the other sites on the peninsula. Perhaps it was traditionally named with Aegina, as the formulaic line of the Hesiodic catalog may indicate. But what of the apparent disorder in Homer's narration of the southern coast of the Akte Peninsula? Why should the poet name Hermione before Athene? The Catalogue of Women may also be helpful in this case. The Hesiod fragment, like Homer's Catalogue of Ships, also treats the cities as a pair, Hermione and Athene. Moreover, Hesiod names the towns in the same order as does Homer, starting with Hermione and going back to Athene. Whereas it might seem that Homer is ignorant of geographical order in an otherwise logical trip around the peninsula, when he proceeds from Tiryns to Hermione and then back again to Athene, he may simply be following Bardic tradition. It may be, as well, that Homer's naming of Hermione before Athene in his narration of the south coast of the Akte Peninsula is not as out of order as it seems. Homer conjoins two sites with a shared epithet, controlling the deep gulf. As you can see from the map, Hermione and Athene can be thought of as controlling the Gulf of Argos, which runs along the entire southern coast of Akte. So in naming the two as a pair, Homer effectively describes the entire south coast of the peninsula. The fact that he names Hermione before Athene, then, is of little significance. Homer conceives of the two towns as a single unit, constituting the entire southern coast of the Akte Peninsula. The itinerary around Argos and Akte, then, flows very logically. We coast down the south side of the peninsula to the east, then head north along, then head west along the north side, and Aegina and Maces, which are a traditional pair, are appended to the end of the catalog. Now, the catalog continues from Argos to the northwest and Mycenae, Agamemnon's kingdom, the second kingdom to be named in the Peloponnese. And this kingdom comprises the Corinthia and the north coast of Achaea. The realm of the Mycenaeans is divided into 4 syntactical groups, governed by 4 separate verbs. These syntactical groups also constitute distinct geographic regions. Mycenae, Corinth, and Cleonae are the first syntactic geographic cluster governed by the verb akon. These sites are also all located along a route north from Mycenae via Cleonae, which is M2 in Lavery's map. And this map is something that we've attached to our exhibit. And I won't press on it because it was going a little slowly earlier, but that's an example of the type of reference that you can include in your map. Now Homer proceeds, so following this first syntactic geographic cluster, Homer proceeds to the second cluster, which is Orneae, Erythraea, and Sicyon. This group of sites falls along a corridor comprising 2 land routes. Orneae Erythraea, right here, and Erythraea Sicyon, right there. The Orneae Erythraea route forms part of an ancient road to Argos. The second road in this corridor from Erythraea north to Sicyon, and I'm quoting Pritchett here, was described by Pausanias 2.11.3 as the direct way to the Gulf of Corinth. So we've got one road running south down to Argos, along which these two sites fall, and then the other corridor of land routes is up north towards the Gulf and Sicyon. Homer next continues west, listing the sites along the northern coast of Achaea, all of which fall along a coastal route, which is Sicyon Patras in the Pittenger tables. So Sicyon Patras. Hyperesia comes first in the very middle of the Achaean coast, and then we head back to Pellene. These are in green. Gonoessa, which is the third city in this cluster, presumably falls somewhere to the east of Hyperesia, because we seem to be starting in the middle and coming back to the east. These three towns are governed by the verb akon. And then the final syntactic geographic cluster falls to the west of Hyperesia, Aegion, furthest to the west, and Helike, those are in orange. These are both governed by the verb amphinemonto. And I'll just mention too, Ms. Clay mentioned that we would like to be able to identify locations that have hitherto not been identified by paying close attention to roots. Gonoessa might be a good example of that kind of thing, where if we have an idea that he begins in the middle and heads east, and then begins at the end and heads east, presumably Gonoessa has to fall somewhere on that portion of coast. So just as Homer organized his description of the Argive contingent according to the geography of the Akte Peninsula, so the geography of the Corinthia and Achaea play a clear role in the organization of the Mycenaean contingent. Whereas roads, however, appear unimportant to the description of the Argive realm. The narration there does not follow the highway from Argos to Epidaurus, for instance. Land routes are of much more conspicuous importance to Agamemnon's kingdom. Each of the four syntactic geographic clusters falls along the path of an ancient roadway. Homer names the four groups of towns in a logical, orderly fashion, proceeding from east to west. This east to west narration is also mirrored in Homer's narration of the entire Peloponnese. So the Peloponnese consists of 6 contingents in total. We've already seen Argos and Akte and Mycenae. He also names Lacedaemonia, Pylos, Arcadia, and Elis. And as you can see from the display, he divides the Peloponnese up into 3 rows of narration, each of these proceeding from the east to the west. So first contingent, second contingent, third contingent, fourth contingent, and then the 5th and the 6th. So that same east-west narration that we saw in the Mycenaean contingent appears to be mirrored on a large scale in the entire Peloponnese. And it's interesting as well that, as I've mentioned, he comes from Athens and Salamis and begins the Peloponnese with Argos. He ends the Peloponnese with the Eleans before proceeding up to Dulichion, the adjacent kingdom and the next contingent to be named. So these are some examples of cases in which Homer's the principle of organization of Homer's contingents is fairly easy to discern. But now for a much more difficult circumstance, Courtney.
One of the great things about using Neatline, as Ben hinted at earlier, is that we can join an interactive timeline feature to an existing map exhibit. We saw briefly how this worked in the Civil War battle exhibit with the battlefields, and there you used a date as a timeline, which makes sense. In our case, we are working with the Scholars Lab people to extend this timeline feature to use text as a timeline, which would be of particular use to us. This means that narrative time can be plotted simultaneously with spatial representation on a map, right? So while the static maps of Argos and Mycenaean that we saw, they will eventually also become non-static maps, that is, they will also eventually have text. And this map as well give you enough information in the sense of narrative progression. The addition of the text as timeline will make that much more readily visualized by the user. So as this particular piece is still in development, we don't have a full working copy for you, but we will at least give you a taste of what it looks like. And this is what it will eventually look like, or something rather like this, with the text here, right? The text obviously on this side, and the map here. And all of these points you can link with points on the map. And notice they're also, again, color-coded in the same way as we've color-coded our points. And if you click on one, it can zoom in. This is also how one way in which you could access that information that we provide, the links to other websites, to bibliographical information, and so on. And what will eventually be available to do on this is to use this text as a timeline. That is, when you scroll down through the text, these places can be added on the map or subtracted on the map as we see fit, right? Now, as I said, that particular feature is not yet up and running. What did I do now? There. It's not yet up and running yet, but we have devised a sort of workaround way to show you what this would look like using the existing timeline feature at present in Neatline. This is a bit of a remnant, so ignore that. But you'll notice that here is a map of Boeotia, and it has no points on it. It does have roads, so we put some roads in. And we've inserted this timeline here, and instead of dates, we've put texts on it. These are line by line, beginning with the start of the Boeotian contingent, and as you slide through, right, you will get points appearing on the map, right, and so on, and so forth, right? So what is really fantastic about this is that it not only allows us to show in real time narrative order and spatial emplotment, but it can let us show, or explore in any case, two ways of that Homer uses to organize his places. One we've already seen, Ben has talked about before, the syntactical groups. That is, lists of towns are grouped with usually one or another verb, akon or enemonta. And so here in Boeotia, you get several different groups. Again, starting with blue. We started with blue and go to red and so on. And so that gives you a sense of the overall grouping according to the syntactical verb choice. But these also can come at you line by line, or we could even do place by place. Should we desire? Here we've done line by line, so you get Aulis and Hyria, Skoinon, Skolon, and Etianos. Yeah, we don't know where Etianos is, and so that's another way to demonstrate Homer's grouping of these physical places according to line placement. Now, as we've seen, Homer's path, at least in the case of the overall path, of the Catalogue of Ships seems to make sense as a sensible itinerary. And as Ben's two exhibits show, within certain contingents, again, there seem to be sensible itineraries or placement based on geographical landmarks or existing road structures. And this particular feature of Neatline will, of course, also help to drive that point home. You'll see the march from east to west along those roads in Mycenaean. This feature of Neatline can also be very valuable in raising other questions and helping to explore other ways of organizing space. So for this, we'll use Boeotia as an example because it's very messy. The Boeotian contingent is notable first and foremost because it is the first contingent of Homer's catalog. And this is a thing that's troubled scholars greatly because the prominence of place given to Boeotia does not seem to match up with their prominence later in the book. They are not very prominent in the battles and elsewhere, but they are given prominence here. Now, some people say that is because Aulis is in Boeotia and that this is the start of the Homeric or of the Trojan expedition. Other people say that it just plays such a large role in this particular expedition, right? Other people say Boeotia was known as having a tradition of catalogue poetry, and so it makes sense to start with Boeotia, given that tradition of catalogue poetry. But if the narrative placement is an oddity, then it's not the only one. For if we start scrolling through this, it becomes somewhat apparent fairly quickly that what we're looking at, although it can be plotted as an itinerary, doesn't really look like a sensible one. I mean, just to back up a little bit, why would one begin here at Aulis and Hieria, makes a sensible beginning point, go to Skoinos, Etianos we don't know, Skolos, okay, but then all the way here to Thespiae, only to go back all the way to the east coast, all the way back to the east coast, to hit Graiae and Mycalessus. When in fact Mycalessus certainly is on the road to Skoinos, if you want to go that way. It's on the road it's on the road going west, right? You would have passed through it, so why not mention it, right? And Thebes itself, who doesn't get mentioned at all. If you plot out all of these points, we don't get to see Thebes, really. There's Hypothebai. But if you were to go to all of these places in the order suggested, you would have passed through Thebes 4 or 5 times. So as a route, as an itinerary, it doesn't make much sense. So if it's not being organized as an itinerary, what is the organizing principle? Well, it is a plane, 2 planes actually, and planes don't give you, by their nature, a whole lot of geographical landmarks with which to build a catalog around. Certainly, this is what Strabo says, and he says it has absolutely no organizing principle at all. And that might be a conclusion to draw, but we at least find that unsatisfying. So using Neatline and playing around with it, we began to think about what was going on. And one model, one way jumped out at us right away, and that was something more like the Trojan catalog. Here again, right, Troy is pictured as the narrative center, as you will, and there are these spokes radiating out from it, always returning to Troy without ever saying so. Right, and if we look at Boeotia, it makes some sense as a way to begin to think about this. Right, there are all of these places here, and they seem really to circle around Troy. Sorry, not Troy, Thebes, and to define the space around it, without ever really mentioning it. As we do this, it's worth pointing out that there is, even in this mess, some general tendency to move from east to west, as we saw with the Peloponnese as a whole. And there is also a general tendency to treat the southern plain before treating the northern plain. But thinking about Thebes as the center from which to organize thoughts about space suggests to us a rather intriguing, though very speculative, model, and that is a specialized type of catalog poetry that you see in Taikoscopia. In the Taikoscopia, there you have as well a central place, a central point, from which you point out people on the battlefield, contingents of men on the battlefield. They generally have direction, and you name the contingents as you are looking out from the walls of Thebes. And Thebes as the center is very much a part of how people thought about Boeotia. Pliny gives a list of the smaller towns in Boeotia, centering on Thebes, even though Thebes was not a significant city in his day. Right? He describes them as those between the Megarid and Thebes, and then the cities on the coast infra-Thebas. His list seems to show very little actual accuracy, because he places places like these between the Megarid and Thebes, and it's hard to imagine how that's possible. But what's important for us is that he locates Thebes as the center of his exploration of Boeotian space. Statius, as well, in his Thebaiad, makes Thebes the center of his Taikoscopia, and then he borrows heavily on this Boeotian catalog piece to describe the Boeotian allies around Thebes. So perhaps what we have here is rather a borrowing, if you will, from another particular place, locating Thebes as its center and talking about rather perhaps contingents of Boeotian allies. It's worth perhaps pointing out that that there are 7 verbs governing these. There are 7 syntactical groups, 7 gates in Thebes, right? So this particular randomness would seem less abrasive if this is sort of the model that we're thinking. Less an itinerary, more a way of looking at space where the narrative speaker is standing at Thebes. It's the center. And if not a direct model, perhaps we can envision this as a borrowing from, again, Boeotian catalogue poetry, but of a very specific type, one that has its borrowings in the Theban cycle, perhaps. Yeah? So, Neatline is a very useful tool for this kind of exploration, right? We never would have come up with this, I think, without watching it as it happened in real time. And it can be, this may not be the best solution, but of course, it does raise this as a solution, even if it also raises more questions, yeah?
Let me just say a few closing remarks, and that is, I hope that our demonstration has shown how these tools, and especially Neatline and the other materials, can be used as a resource, and that you've seen now in the case of Argos and Mycenaean, we seem to be dealing with something that can vaguely be called itineraries, and that seemed to confirm our hypothesis. But equally important for us is how some data does not fit. And that forces us to consider other ways of organizing and defining space. And in the case of Thebes, as Courtney has shown us, we are led to think about the manner in which Boeotia is presented and possible sources, pre-Homeric, perhaps pre-Homeric epic traditions. And I expect as we move forward, we'll come upon other unexpected findings that will lead us in different directions and perhaps different explanations. And maybe this is really the most important result of our work so far. We've really created a resource which can be used by others and used for different kinds of questions and ideas, and the wherewithal to use these tools for further research. And although our material is not up on the web yet, we invite you all to look at neatline.org, which has demonstrations and examples and what is called in the lingo a sandbox, which is a place to play, and to see and think about this as a resource for not only proving a hypothesis, but in fact opening up possibilities for further research and further explanations. So thank you very much, and we hope to hear some useful comments from you. We're very excited about all this, and it wasn't a major glitch.